I made $80,000 passively my first year. And I was like, how is this even possible?
You started to get approached to manage other people's properties. Was this a light bulb moment for you as far as, okay, this model makes sense?
I basically lost everything. It keeps going up and up and up. Then you start to realize, you're like, why don't I just buy the building? If I can afford the rent, can I afford the mortgage?
It takes that entrepreneurial mindset to find the opportunity, to see it, to be willing to take the risk.
We went into contract, and 3 months later, we were going to get the key. During those 3 months, I watched over 100 episodes of Flip My House.
You've been able to replace the same level of income that you would have had from your W-2. You go all in. What happened next? Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hospitality Edge podcast, where we bring together what we think are two sides of the same coin, real estate and hospitality. Today, I'm super excited to be here with Shannon St. She's the owner and founder at Elevate Vacation Rentals. Shannon, thank you so much for being here today. Why don't you please tell us where you're based and give us a quick update, quick background story of how you got to where you are today at a high level, and then we're going to go into the actual story and break it down step by step.
Yeah. I'm based out of New York. Well, first, thanks for having me. But I'm based out of New York City. And just a little bit about my background. Was educated finance and real estate. And then I graduated at the subprime meltdown era. So my first job out of college was at GE Capital doing portfolio analytics in the real estate group. But then, the whole world crashed and we got all laid off, and I transitioned into finance. So I spent some time working in the New York Stock Exchange with FINRA. And then I moved over to consulting, where I was specializing in broker-dealers and investment management firms at KPMG. And then amazing thing happened almost 10 years ago, where I was one of the first few people in New York that was doing Airbnb, started off doing rental arbitrage, and kind of spiraled. So started off with a few apartments, ended up with a ton of apartments, and then started to manage for other people. And then now I'm in the phase where I have master leases, I manage for owners, and then I also have my own investments where we manage for ourselves as well. So it's been a little bit of everything there, but yeah.
That's awesome. So it's been about 9 years, right?
Mhm.
Since you kind of jumped into this. So can you please take us back to, you had a corporate job that you had, studied for, and, this is an elite, type of corporate employment, right? That people, aspire for and whatnot. So what goes through your mind that leads you to start this side project? Did it start as a side project and then it kind of became a main thing? Like, what was the timeline of making that transition from your W-2 to eventually becoming an entrepreneur?
Yeah, you know what it is? I think you almost always have it in your, in you. Like, you feel like you're supposed to be doing something else. But I will say it was a little bit more natural, right? Like, I was working in consulting, so I was traveling a lot, and I was like, let me rent out my apartment. This new thing, Airbnb, is in New York. Let me rent it out and let me just see, see what I can make from that. So I was like, okay, made some extra cash. And it dawned on me, I was like, wow, I made $80,000 passively my first year. And I was like, how is this even possible? And I was like, all right, well, as they say, the math is math. And so I was like, all right, well, let me do another property and let me get another property. And so it just became, it was just almost natural. And then you start to realize, like, okay, now I have enough to quit my job. I can do this full time. So it was a natural evolution. But I think it also takes a little bit of an entrepreneurial spirit to see the opportunity, right? It did take some investment up front, right? Because in order to get an apartment, I started off doing rental arbitrage, where I was renting and re-renting it. But you need in New York City, where you needed at least $3,000 for the deposit, $3,000 for the first month rent, and then another $3,000 to furnish the unit. So you're talking about a $9,000 upfront investment, but in the grand scheme of things, I made the money back in a month. So you're talking about 100% return in 1 month. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out, like, the math makes sense. And you're like, well, hold on, I'm making $10,000 in my first month. Maybe I should really consider this. So it's just right place, right time, and then also seeing the opportunity and taking a little bit of risk.
And if we break down the timeline of how that happened, how long were you doing arbitrage for as a side project before kind of deciding to go in all in, full time?
So it was about a year and a half, almost two. I think I was like a year and 9 months. The first year I was just like casually doing it, and it just kind of, and then I think the second year I realized like, oh, let me actually go get another apartment because I was doing it out of my own apartment. Um, and then I was like, oh, let me go actively get a new apartment. And then the second apartment I got, I realized like, oh man, I'm actually matching my salary. Or it was like the second or third apartment. I was like, I'm matching my salary. So now I should just maybe consider doing this full time because imagine if I had more time to work on it. So from I would say about a year to 2 years is when I made the transition, but I didn't want to jump until after I knew it was, you know,
Hmm.
I was going to be able to sustain myself because yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And to your point, it takes that entrepreneurial mindset to find the opportunity, to see it, to be willing to take the risk, to put the upfront capital to make that initial investment. But then I also think that the part of like going all in, despite having seen some early traction, is I'm super intrigued by, was were there second thoughts? Was it a hard decision for you? Was it so like intuitive because you just saw the early traction, you knew that was
I
next?
mean, it was hard because I was doubting myself. Like I come from an immigrant family, and my family's actually from Haiti, and so um, and I was one of the first to go to college and to do well. And so I think my mother was like, why do you give up your good job to to go do this, to go
Hmm.
do Airbnb? What are you doing? So yes, it was really hard. I was doubting myself. And you know what I thought about? I was like, I know that I'm smart enough, I'm skilled enough. If this doesn't work, and I know I didn't burn any bridges at my company, I could always come back. And I think what you start to realize is that, and I think when people are afraid, and I don't want to confuse this at all. I was afraid. I was afraid. I was nervous whether I was making the right decision. I remember at KPMG, I was trying to get a sabbatical where I could like tip my toe in, and they wouldn't allow me, they wouldn't approve the sabbatical, right? Because I was a key employee and they wouldn't approve it for me. So I was like, man, I'm gonna have to quit. Like this is scary.
Hmm.
Um, but you think about, and I always just tell people, it's a risk calculation, right? And you're betting on yourself. Like I'm not silly. I didn't leave without making enough, without knowing that I had enough money. So it wasn't about the money. It was about the fear of it not working out. Let's say after a few months of being in it. Um, but it was scary, and a lot of people thought I was crazy. And it's interesting because I would say more people told me not to do it than to do it. And I think sometimes as an entrepreneur or just anyone that's starting a business, you really have to know, you have to be confident in yourself and also know that you did the calculations. I did the math.
Hmm.
I know that if I spent more time on this, I'd make more than working in corporate, and you just got to go. And I always just tell people it's pros and cons. It's numbers. Does the
Hmm.
numbers make sense? Do you know that you're smart enough that you can go find another job afterwards? I was like, yeah. And I built relationships up, and I knew that I could, if it didn't work out, I can go back and go beg for my job or go find another company that would take me. So it's fine.
That's awesome. So we'll get into what happened next, but before that, I just want to sort of close that phase of your career with, what are some lessons, or what are some things that you think, having worked in consulting, taught you and have helped you, get to where you are today?
I will say, and I'm a little bit biased because I actually think a lot more people should work in corporate before they start their own business. And again, this is me, I'm totally biased. And that's because I learned so many like structural skills and organizational skills. And I think a lot of people, I think one of my competitive advantages, especially in this industry, because a lot of people um, in property management don't necessarily have as much as the corporate background. And so I was very organized. I was very structured. I was very much so about efficiency because we had to measure we were rated, we were logging our time and making sure we were being efficient with our clients and billable hours. And there was so much structure that being able to apply that to the property management space, I definitely think gave me an edge. Um, I would say the other thing is like, funny enough, presentations. People love beautiful things, if that makes sense. So in consulting, one of the things you'd have to do, you go in, you look, you do a project or whatever, and then you'd have to present it. And I'll never forget, my boss said that part of what they're paying us for is this beautiful PowerPoint presentation. And so there's something about making things beautiful. And so I think I've been able to win some clients over because I've been able to present really my numbers, my data, and I present it as if it's a beautiful deck that you'd present to a client as an end result. And it just comes off more polished because you come off as if, you come up more professional. And I think that's been another um, competitive advantage that I learned in corporate. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I can totally see how those presentation skills, can come very handy, when it comes to starting any kind of business. I'm curious on the organizational side, and the focus on efficiency. Any examples? Anything that comes to mind as to how you've been able to apply those skills that you learn back in consulting, back in corporate, within your short-term rental operation?
I mean, even basic stuff like SOPs. I know they seem simple, but a lot of property
Hmm.
management companies, believe it or not, do not have procedures and processes for all of their things. So my rule of thumb is, if this task is being done more than once, we should have an SOP for it.
Hmm.
When I say SOP, it's called Standard Operating Procedure, which is a high level document on how to do it. Because we want to be able to document it. So when that person's not around and someone else needs to take do their job, or if something goes wrong, like there's steps on how to complete every single thing. And all it is people do, how would you say, those systems actually make you more productive. And the other
Hmm.
thing I'd say, one big hack, and this is actually funny enough, I got this from KPMG when I was working in corporate, is we were starting to offshore. And so I started with a VA before it became popular with the VA, with virtual assistants. And so I started about 9 years ago. I was working with VAs and paying $3, $4 an hour for an assistant. And so I was extremely efficient, which caused me to actually have more money saved up. So then I could do some more investments because I didn't have the staff that
Hmm.
that a lot of the property management companies had. So my motto was, if anything that's done on a computer should be done abroad. The only
That's
people that I
interesting.
want doing work on a computer, or the only people that I want doing work in the US, are my cleaners, my maintenance, the people that are on the ground that has to do work. But if you're at a computer, that job can be done abroad for
Hmm.
a fraction of the cost. So yeah.
That's super interesting. That's super interesting. And in terms of SOPs, I'm curious, like, was this something that you started doing like from the very beginning? Or because, especially like to your point, entrepreneurs that don't have that structure in terms of their background might not see the need for it in the early stages. They might not see the value in taking the time to do it. But was it something that you from the very, very beginning, like you were looking at being so disciplined about more than twice, if I do this more than twice, I put in place the procedure? Or like,
Let me
at
let
which
me
point
say,
do you think it starts to make
yeah,
sense,
I'm not
to
perfect at it. However, I go back and I look at some of my, we had a company manual and I would link it all in Google Doc, and it would be, yeah, from the very beginning, we started doing procedures. But what you realize is that you have a team. And so you had to figure out how to transfer knowledge, especially when you're running, this property. There's not one person that can be, responding to all the guest communications and helping out. So you needed systems in place. And yeah, I started it pretty early on, and it's been helpful. Yeah. That was
That's interesting. Well, let's go back to that timeline, right? So you decide, you see that there's been some early traction. Now you've been able to replace, or basically get to the same level of income that you would have had, from your W-2. You go all in. What happened next? At that point, was it just about scaling the arbitrage model, or were you already started to think about management and acquiring? What came next?
It was just scaling the arbitrage model. I didn't even think about management until New York passed some regulations in 2019, and they really, and then 2020 definitely made me. Once COVID happened, I was like, all right, well, can't operate in New York. So I need to really think through how to build out another market. So I made so much for the first few years that I bought a place in New York City. I was just solely just doing the arbitrage. And then regulations had changed. So I was in there when the getting was good. And yeah, so.
So you scale the arbitrage model more or less, to what level, like what kind of size, what kind of scope, just to give us an
It
idea.
varied year to year. So at its peak, we had about 15.
Okay.
But yeah, which was plenty, to be honest, for just
For
to
sure.
for by yourself to have plenty of yeah. So it was I was doing fine. And then in 2019, because I had a whole bunch of friends that worked on Wall Street and that owned homes in Martha's Vineyard and in the Hamptons, someone knew that I was doing this, like, hey, I need a property manager. And I was like, all right, I can do it. I'm doing it for myself. Why couldn't I do it for you? And it just
Hmm.
word of mouth. So I would say I've never actively advertised or market, and all of my business have been word of mouth. And I love that because my clients are the owners that come to me are because they heard of me from another owner. And there's something about, I don't know, there's something I kind of take pride in that. Now, am I going to explode into a 200 property company? No. And guess what? I don't want to, because I can be very selective about the owners that I take on. I'm very particular about who I work with, what the value of them is, because you in this space, and you say with the short-term rentals, you could have a property, and you could have a property that's only bringing in $100 a night. You could have a property that's bringing in $1,000 a night. It's pretty much the same work, almost the same amount of work.
Hmm.
$1,000 a night, $100 a night, same amount of work. So to me, the metric was never about getting as many properties as possible. It's about getting the right properties that are yielding the right numbers, and then therefore you can work less and have less overhead, or less people to manage, all for the same amount of
Hmm.
revenue. So I think it's about being smarter. And I guess my finance background, I'm very particular about revenue management, very particular about the numbers and making sure we're there. So, and looking at margin.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's it. That's it. So okay. So you started to get approached to manage other people's properties,
Mm.
and was this kind of like a light bulb moment for you, as far as like, okay, this model makes sense in terms of management because there's less upfront capital required, perhaps, or whatnot, and you start going all in on that side, or did you keep sort of growing both the arbitrage and the management kind of in parallel?
I was growing them in parallel. Well, let me backtrack. So in 2020 and 2019, the laws had changed. So I was not able to necessarily do the arbitrage anymore because New York was cracking down on that and was no longer allowing it. So to me, I just kept the arbitrage that I did have that were already in existence, and then I um, expanded. It was more about diversifying. Like, one thing you learn is that you don't put all your eggs in one basket. And so, especially as an entrepreneur and being in the short-term rental management space, you're subject to so many regulations. So it was more about diversifying. I will say that you definitely make more money doing the arbitrage, right? But it was more about expanding myself and also having that diversification in the portfolio. So if one was down, then the other, then I wouldn't lose anything, because there was a moment during COVID where, you think about all the arbitrage. I had a lot of apartments in my name, so over $40,000 of rents that I was paying, and you're thinking to yourself like, oh my God, I don't have enough money to pay all these rents. Well, I basically lost everything in a sense during COVID. I I paid everyone on time. And so that's something I'm very, very proud of, because I know a lot of people didn't pay their rents. Every single landlord, every single person I worked with, I paid everyone on time, and they got all their money when it was about a year where I made no money. Um, and it was scary. I had to lay off everyone, and one of the most heartbreaking. This is a story I'll never forget. One of my cleaners who was with me since the very beginning, and my motto was like, I the people who's been with me the longest get seniority, right? And so first in, whatever, for last out. So this woman, she had a husband, and there was another cleaner that I was working with that she didn't have anyone to support her. So I had to lay the woman off who had a husband during COVID, and not the woman who was single. And my calculus was that at least she had someone to support her, and the other one did. And it was just heartbreaking. The whole thing was heartbreaking. I lost so much money. And this is why arbitrage is very dangerous too, because when things are not going well, you're on the hook. And some people, there's a lot of people that went bankrupt. There's a lot of people that didn't make it out. Like I know in New York, so many people went out of business
Hmm.
during that period. And fortunately, I had some savings, and I was actually supposed to buy a building that year, and I lost. I had about 200,000 in savings, and I lost it all, and I was just struggling. It was tough. It was tough. Yeah.
Wow, wow, that's crazy. And would you say that other than having been conservative in terms of having good amounts of savings put aside, would you say there was anything else as far as what you had, how you had structured your contracts, perhaps, or the way you had planned your model that allowed you to make it through even though it was tough, or
I mean, the margins were good when they were good. So I think I just had low overhead. I immediately laid off the people that we had to lay off. One, because there just wasn't any work happening because New York was hit pretty bad during COVID. So I'd like to say that I was some brilliant and I had structured this all well. No, it was just, and I think it was just actually foolishness of me as well, because I know a lot of people left New York as soon as COVID had happened. In April, May, people were just like, I'm getting out of my leases, I'm out. And I think this is the entrepreneurial spirit where you think things are going to get better, and
Mm,
we're always optimistic. So I kept thinking, okay, it's going to get better, it's going to get better, it's going to get better, and I stuck it out. In some cases I probably shouldn't have, but
mm,
but it's interesting because through those relationships, because I paid all my rents. There was a landlord that I was trying to get the building for in Midtown, and I actually have the building now, where the person that was doing Airbnb out of his building that he had a master lease for left him high and dry. And so he came to me and was like, Shannon, either you take the lease now or you don't take it. And so he gave me the lease in like September, October 2020, when COVID was still happening. No, and I was responsible for paying that rent during that period. But I paid it even though I wasn't making any money, because I knew the opportunity. And maybe I was naive, but eventually that next year things turned back around. But I paid that rent, and I took the contract during the worst time. But I knew, and I'm just going to be frank, I'm a Black woman. I look really young. And I knew the opportunity wouldn't come around to manage a building in Midtown in Times Square. He wouldn't give it to me again. And so I shot
wow.
shots. So yeah, it was scary. It was, no doubt it was scary. And yeah.
But you made it through. And so tell me something. When you're talking about it, you mentioned that of course there was COVID and that situation where, I mean, you're mentioning you had to basically empty your savings to still manage to pay rent, which is impressive. To your point, a lot of people just
Yeah.
didn't pay. But then you talked about regulations. Can you just refresh our memories in terms of the timeline and the regulations? Was that after COVID? Was that before, within? Like, because you mentioned that also affected your ability to continue scaling the arbitrage model. So was that kind of like the next challenge you faced, or happened kind of at the same time?
So regulation happened right before COVID, but a lot of it
Right
wasn't
before.
going into effect until like 2020. I think it was some. I will admit this has been a few years, so my timing is slightly off here. But
Hmm.
but I remember the regulation. There's always been regulation in New York. It's just they just weren't necessarily enforcing it, and so
Hmm.
And so, and it was just kind of a lot of gray. So a lot of people didn't fully understand. It wasn't codified. It was just confusing. And so I actually didn't know either, like what the rules were and how it was. And so obviously we didn't know what we were allowed to do versus what we weren't allowed to do. And so once it became very clear that we weren't allowed to operate these specific type of buildings, I was like, oh, okay, can't, I need to, transition into something else. And unfortunately, all of that happened during COVID as well.
Mm.
So it was
Okay, so
regulation
that
happening
all
in
happened at the
COVID.
same time.
Yeah. So,
Mm.
but so there are some buildings, like the buildings that I have now in New York are all legal. They're Class B buildings that are allowed to be, they're zoned for transient use and they have the proper designation. But a lot of us didn't know the difference between which buildings were and which buildings were not allowed.
Mhm.
So yeah, so the timing, it was just a very difficult time, but yeah, we made it. I made it.
So some people, well, congrats on making it. That's crazy. That's super super inspiring. Now, there was a lot of talks about the regulations in New York and how that was basically setting an example that could be hurtful for the industry as a whole of what other cities could do in the future. Can you tell us, like, what are some of the misconceptions, because I'm sure you must have heard a lot of misconceptions of what the impact of those regulations were, like what is it that changed really at the end of the day, and how is it that now you're still able to operate in some capacity? Is it, you're talking about the building classes like type B? Is it just about like the zoning? Is it just about the location? Is it about the number of properties? Like, what are some of the misconceptions, and how is it that you're still able to operate despite
Yeah.
those regulations?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and it's a lot. It's a little complicated, but I'll kind of simplify it a little bit. I think the biggest misconception, especially in the media, because I think a lot of the reporters didn't even really know, or the journalists didn't even fully understand what the laws were, because it is very, very confusing.
Mhm,
Essentially, a lot of the media just said that Airbnb is banned in New York, but it's not true.
mhm,
Airbnb is still allowed in New York. It's just depending on which buildings are classified to be able to do Airbnb, right? However, unfortunately, that means that the majority of the units that were in New York, which is, I would say, I don't know the exact number, but let's just throw out there 90% of the buildings or the apartments that were listed were not really allowed. And so now
mhm,
you just had to go out and find the buildings that were allowed. And the city puts out a list, right? There's a list. It's now the city put out a list. It wasn't a list. It wasn't as obvious before, but now the city has tried to make it easier.
and is it a list of buildings, a list of zones,
List
areas?
list of buildings that they put out, and it's all public, right?
Okay.
This is all public record. But it's hard. Like a lot of these buildings, you can't do it. You have to get permission. You have to apply. There's a whole process around it. And because I've been in the business for so long in New York City that like I knew all the rules, I'm one of the crazy people that actually read all the housing rules. I paid for multiple attorneys. I was one of the, like, I went through and read all 200 pages. Yeah. I went through and read the entire rule that the city wrote. Yeah. And so I think once you understand, like I was highlighting it, and now with ChatGPT, you can just summarize, you can do, well,
Mhm,
obviously you want to actually go through and read it. So you understood. So then I was like, okay, if this is the restraint, this is the constraint. Now I need to go find how do I work within the parameters to be legal. And that's what we did. Yeah.
mhm. That's awesome. That's awesome. Talk to me about your transition.